Now, I'm pretty sure that I'm going to title the podcast something like this, so we're just going to jump into it for straight up. I watched Pulp Fiction for the first time. That's right. I went over to Katz, and we were going to continue the Nickelodeon marathon. I think the next movie was Hotel for Dogs. We didn't get to that. So we were just like sitting around after we ate, and then we were just talking about something, and I forget how the subject got to it, but I think I made a joke about, that guy, there's like a meme about the type of guy who's like, you haven't seen Pulp Fiction? Like the real pretentious kind of film guy. I made a joke about that, or she did, or something like that, and I mentioned, I still have never watched that. I have never watched a Tarantino movie at all, ever. And Kat said, oh yeah, the reason I haven't shown it to you is because I think you'd hate it. And I was like, what? That really caught my interest. Like, I didn't have a particular interest in seeing it at first. It wasn't like, I gotta watch Pulp Fiction. But her saying that really, really piqued my attention. And I was like, why do you say that? And she said, I think you'd think it was pretentious. I was like, well, now I want to watch it. Now I'm really curious to watch it. Now that you've almost given me like a challenge. Because that's so funny, right? Like someone could say, oh, you'd like it. And I can go, yeah, I probably would. But someone that says, oh, you'd hate it. You'd hate it. Now, for some reason, that makes me like, well, would I hate it? Maybe I would. I don't know why that, like, has that ever happened to anyone else? Because I feel like I hear the former way more, where obviously when someone recommends something to you, you're like, oh yeah, but you never actually go watch it or something, There's one friend of mine who actually did watch something after I recommended it to him, and he really enjoyed it, and I was like, wow, you're very cool and nice. And it made me feel bad, because I was like, oh man, I don't know if I would have done this thing. He's just this really nice guy who's a friend of mine. And like the whole thing, he's a car guy. So I was like, oh yeah, you ever heard of, Initial D? Yeah, it's like a racing anime. And then like a few months later, he just goes, oh yeah, so I watched all of Initial D, which is like a 5-season anime. And I was like, what? Oh, what'd you think? And he just, like, we just talked about it for a bit, because I've never seen it. I just knew that, like, oh yeah, you might enjoy it. And it was like, wow. That's really, I don't know, that's very impressive for some reason to me. Anyway, she owns it on DVD, so we just decided to pop it in then and there and watch it. Man, I did not know that this movie was like it's like 2.5 hours, roughly 2 hours 15, maybe if you take out the credits. Yeah, it's like let's just say 2.5 hours. So Pulp Fiction, I didn't like it that much. And it's weird for me to say, okay, when I say that I didn't like it, I have to explain myself, because it doesn't mean that I hated it. I actually think it's probably a pretty good movie. It's more so that I don't think I'm capable of liking it. And it's really a me problem, and it's not the movie's fault. I don't even know if it's my fault. It's just kind of like, I don't know. It's just sort of like an impartial fact of life. So my problem with the movie is that I was watching it and I realized that I have watched some amount of almost every scene in this movie throughout over the course of my entire life. I realized it was so funny, because I've been watching like Video Game Donkey for like almost 10 years now, and it's so funny because I'm like, oh wait, this is absolutely like got to be one of his favorite movies, because he references it all the time. With either just lines or little. He loves using the shot of Samuel L. Jackson's character drinking the Sprite. Yeah, it's Sprite. Drinking the soda cup, right? He loves using that shot. He loves just like, this other thing. Just like so many little references. And I was like, oh yeah, it's that. And just, this is such a widely referenced film it's the only thing that I could relate it to is like Portal. You guys remember when I talked about finally sitting down and playing the Portal games and how that was so weird for me because I know everything that happens in them, and like story wise, and because I just grew up watching Let's Plays of it. I had a kind of a similar experience with this movie. Maybe not quite as intimately, but Pulp Fiction feels like a movie that is impossible for me to approach on its own terms. Like pretty much every other film, I can watch it and usually look at it for like in its time, in its context. I'm very used to doing that with like video games, for instance. You know, you play something that's really old, which I do a lot, and it might not be the most impressive thing in a modern context, but when I think back to it, I can, or, you know, when I put it into its historical context, you can appreciate it a lot more. And for some reason, it was really difficult for me to do that with this movie. Yeah, I'm assuming that everyone listening to this has also watched the film, and if you haven't, I just spoil everything on this podcast. So if you care about that, then I don't know. Tune out, I guess. Skip to the next segment, which is also for a movie you definitely haven't seen. A very obscure film. Yeah, so how do I describe my experience with Pulp Fiction? Like actually sitting down and watching the movie. A lot of it, most of the runtime was me kind of pointing at the camera and going, "Oh, it's that line. I know that line. Oh, I know this shot. Yeah." And I could never get into it. You know when you watch something and it's good, right? And you're like, "Oh, I'm really into this." You're probably not consciously thinking that, but like you know the feeling, right? When you're, "Oh, I'm really into this." I was like watching this and acknowledging, you know, yeah, I can totally see the quality here. The way that it's shot is pretty interesting in a lot of ways. The dialogue and the way that it really hangs on it. It's a very conversational movie. A lot of stylistic elements. I can totally understand that, but I just can't get into it because it's too much of an external experience for me. I'm reminded of a podcast that I listened to called, oh gosh, I think it's called Newcomers, which is a terrible name. It's way too broad, but it was essentially these two, I believe they're like actresses on something. They were on like some show together or something like that. They're friends, and they did this podcast because despite being in their, I think, I want to say 30s, they had never watched a Star Wars film. They'd never really watched a Star Wars anything. And they made this podcast because I believe pre-Rise of Skywalker. And they went through, and every episode was them watching. It was their thoughts on watching the series in its release order, not starting from the prequels, starting from like A New Hope, going original trilogy, prequels, and then the two sequels that had been out. And that was a really interesting podcast to listen to because, well, for one, I have a very different perspective because I grew up watching Star Wars. So it's interesting to hear someone who had never, because it's such a dominant thing in pop culture, like everywhere. It's impossible to have avoided references to it. And for them, I remember a lot of their thoughts. Not the entire thing. It was definitely different from me watching the old PF. But for them, there was a lot of moments where they would go, "Yeah, I was watching it, and I was like, oh, that's who Yoda is? Huh, okay, that's what he does? All right. Oh, this is where that line... Oh, okay, yeah." And that's the only thing that I can think of that really reminds me of this. I just, over the course of my life, I've seen so many different scenes. Like, I knew pretty much all the major character deaths. I knew basically everything that happened with the exception of, like, one scene, which is the scene where Uma Thurman's character overdoses. And that was, like, the first time that I actually realized that that was the first time that I actually felt invested in the movie. And I don't know if that's the film's fault or if it's my own experiences, like my own history's fault, right? Because it was like, oh shit, something happened. something happened. The whole movie up to that point feels like establishing. It just feels like establishment. It's so strange because the third movie I want to talk about is also a very, it's definitely like a slow burn, very like mood piece kind of film, but I liked it a lot more. Okay. So, I realized about, once you get really into the Bruce Willis stuff, I kind of understood more how the film was structured. Well, I understood how it was structured, but I actually started being able to put it together, because at that point you have enough pieces to start actually putting the timeline together. And I was thinking about this because I don't think I like the way that the film is structured. Obviously, it is based around hopping around from one point in time to another in this series of, I don't know, it feels like it takes place over the course of maybe a week at most, if you kind of intuit a little bit of downtime between the John Travolta story and the who's Bruce Willis. I just kept thinking of his character's name is Vincent Butch. So as I understood it, Kat and I had a bit of a communication breakdown when trying to talk about the movie, because she understood it in the way that she was describing it in the way that the movie is presented, which is 3 segments, and I understood it in the way that made sense to me, which is that it's 2 plot lines. There is the Vince plot line and the Butch plot line. Vince's being, it starts with him and Samuel L. Jackson's character, whose name I don't remember, going to the apartment to get the briefcase and shoot those guys. They're going to get shot, and then all the bullets miss. They are on their way back to... they're going to deliver the briefcase when they accidentally kill the dude that they took, I guess, a hostage. I don't know what their intention was with him. But they took him along. Vince accidentally shoots him. They go to Quentin Tarantino's house to get it cleaned up. They call the cleaner guy. Quentin Tarantino drops like 5 hard R's in 30 seconds. After that's done, they go to the diner where the stick-up? Yeah, the stick-up. Where the hostage stick-up scene happens. And that's basically actually kind of it. Then they just go return the briefcase to Marcellus, the crime boss. And then that kind of starts the over... Oh, and then Vince actually, I guess, sometime later has the date with Mia, Uma Thurman's character, and they go back to the house. She overdoses. He goes to his dealer, and they revive her, and then that's just kind of the end of that. And that doesn't really go anywhere. Doesn't really lead to anything. And then we go to, and then Butch's story, which is actually much more contained now that I think about it. Technically starts with him in the flashback, chronologically, of him getting the watch. Then he's a boxer. As an adult, he is told by Marcellus to throw the match. He decides not to. He goes back to the apartment. He's going to leave with his girlfriend. But then, oops, she forgot to bring the watch when she cleaned his apartment out and took the important possessions. He goes back to the apartment, kills Vince. That's a great scene. And then goes to fucking crashes his car into Marcellus. On accident, they do the whole thing with fucking chasing each other around. They get kidnapped to get put into the gay sex basement. Sorry, I believe the politically correct term is the Gex basement. Marcellus... he saves Marcellus and then leaves, and then they ride off. And that's basically the 2 plot lines. Now, okay, so here's the thing. I can totally see Quentin Tarantino figuring out, because the script is by him. I think there's like a co-writing on the script, or the story by. There's a story by and a script. Script is purely by Tarantino, but I believe story by was also... I think he probably just hammered out the story with another person. But he wrote the script mainly. I can totally see him... This definitely feels like his story in a lot of ways. I can totally see him figuring out the plot and really settling in on this is exactly what he wants and becoming very committed to this overall narrative, right? Excuse me. And then figuring it all out and sitting down and trying to write it and going, fuck, it doesn't work as a movie. Because it really doesn't. It doesn't work as a film if you lay it out end to end chronologically. Because really, it's two stories that have very little overlap. They take place in proximity to each other, but they don't really have anything to do with each other outside of a few aspects. Obviously, I think Bruce Willis's character killing John Travolta's it seems like it's important to the plot. I think it was important that it was Vince, because the scene in the diner, I like that. I like that technically the scene in the diner almost foreshadows, even though it comes afterwards. It's kind of like a bit of like pretty brutal irony that Vince can't imagine, Samuel L. Jackson's character wants to leave the life of crime, and Vince cannot imagine a life different from the one that he leads, which ironically ends up in him dying. And I also like how it's not like a particularly, it's not a particularly ironic death. It's kind of just wrong time, just bad time. It was right place, wrong timing. If Butch had been even 10, 20 seconds earlier or later to the house, it probably would have been completely reversed. Butch probably would have died because Vince was waiting for him. So I like that. I like the kind of like irony in the event of his death, and that it's just kind of like a thing that happens that Butch has very little emotionally really invested in. That he's just kind of a guy that he's like, well, okay, I guess I gotta kill you now. It's really the only way that it could have ended. But other than that, there's very little overlap between these two stories. And so the out of order, the non-linear way that the film is structured is kind of necessary to make it work. But at the same time, I also don't like it. And it works probably better than if it had just been laid end to end. But I also don't like the way the movie is structured. The film feels like it starts 3 different times. One time at the beginning of the actual film. One time when you start the Bruce Willis segment, really. And then a third time at the scene where... the third, like, half of the movie, I guess, where... what the fuck is the guy's name? That dude's hiding... It's when you start with the guy hiding in the bathroom and we're back to the apartment. And then we go from that to the cleanup scene to the diner robbery. And it's like... I remember... Okay, so my favorite part of the movie, I think the best part of the movie is it starts exactly when Bruce Willis goes to get the watch back from his apartment. I thought that scene was great. I love the long... There's a lot of long held shots in the film, but it's mostly used for dialogue, which I think is kind of like a flex on Tarantino's part to show that he can write engaging dialogue, which I think is like generally pretty good. It's not like my favorite ever, but I think it's like pretty good. There's some funny lines and stuff like that. But this is the first time in the movie that I could recall that one of these long tracking shots was used for like action. I don't mean action in terms of like fighting or conflict. It's like a thing is happening. It's not two people talking. It's used to build tension. And I was actually very invested. I like how it's in broad daylight, but it's this kind of shitty, ratty-ass neighborhood in Los Angeles where it feels like someone could get gunned down in broad daylight. And it's following behind him. You can't really see what's around the corners, just like he can't. There's just like all this negative space where people could be, or I didn't know what was going to happen. And for me, that was really engaging. And then that all the way through, like that whole chain of events, I love the fact that he gets in the car after he gets the watch and he feels like he's on top of the world. And then he stops and he sees Marcellus crossing the street. Oh, it's perfect. It's like this perfect... It's like, man, when Tarantino wants things to happen in his movie, it's pretty interesting. When he wants conflict to happen, it's actually pretty engaging. That whole just super chaotic fight where he's got like a bunch of fucking glass in him after he crashes the car and Marcellus is like stumbling down the sidewalk shooting at him. All the way through to the stuff with in the Gex dungeon and then leaving and going back to his girlfriend. Oh, fantastic. And as they were riding away on the chopper, which I was extremely satisfied. And I learned later that the sound of the chopper, the sound of the engine, is the same one that plays at the beginning of the movie when they show the definition for what Pulp Fiction is. So for me, that was like, oh, okay, that was a very satisfying stretch of the movie. I was consistently very engaged in what was happening, and I was really satisfied with the resolution. And then you cut to the guy in the bathroom, and I said, how fucking long is this movie? Just like, God, every time something happens, it just feels like the movie, all the momentum just hits a brick wall, and it has to like get up and pick itself up and just dust itself off and start slowly building up speed again. And it happens like 3 times in the movie, which is fine at the beginning, but man, after the overdose scene, it's like, fuck, there's a lot of waiting. There's a lot of just fucking waiting around, and it's because it's such a completely different, it's a different story. It's basically a different movie. Oh man, it really drags, you know? And it's hard because there's good things about that. Like, I really like the relationship between Butch and the girlfriend. She's very cute, and when I pointed that out, Kat was like, I knew you'd say that. I'm like, what? I'm gonna get... Well, yeah, I wouldn't say that. I like the way that they interact, and I like the scene where he freaks out, and he has to apologize. Like, a lot of really strong characterization for the both of them. And, like, it's good. It's just like, okay, all right, we're just waiting around. We have to, a new movie has to start that I have to become invested in again. And God, the fucking thing with the bat, and it just takes so long. It takes so fucking long. I think I would have much preferred this movie if you took the 2 plot lines, separated them, and like laid them out chronologically, and then just presented it as 2 separate episodes. I think I would have much preferred that as a film. Although I don't know if like the Vince stuff works, because it feels I don't know. I don't really like that storyline. I didn't really care much for it. So part of the problem is definitely overexposure, because I know like every single line that people quote all the fucking time from that scene with the apartment. I know pretty much the entire diner scene. I know, and it's still like a good scene, but it's like the only thing that I wasn't familiar with the overdose part, and I didn't know really about the part where they have to go to Quentin Tarantino's house. Those 2 scenes were like new to me. But overall, the Vince stuff, I just never really found myself caring that much for either of the characters. Until, like, literally the very end of the goddamn movie when Samuel L. Jackson's character decides to develop. And I thought that stuff was cool. Here's the problem. This is a very backloaded movie. All the interesting stuff happens at, like, the hour mark about. And the first half is, like, very, very... I don't know. Like, I just never got really interested in it. I didn't care that much about his date with Uma Thurman. I don't know. Why didn't I care about it? Because everyone fucking likes quoting this movie. That's the thing. After I finished it, I realized, because I was trying to think we were talking about it, and I was trying to explain how I felt to her. Because Kat really likes this film. And I was trying to think of common praises I've heard of it so that I can kind of just compare what I thought, right? Like, well, a lot of people say they like this, but did that resonate to me? And I realized I don't know what people even like about this movie. People just reference it. I don't even know what they like about it, which is so weird because, like, I've never seen a Martin Scorsese movie either. But I know, like, what people like about The Godfather, like, in broad strokes, right? Like, I've heard that, the characters and the culture, I don't know, the what would you call it? Internal politics? That might not be the best word for it. But, like, the mob story. I understand the appeal, and I understand, like, from a distance what people enjoy about it. But Pulp Fiction, I don't know what the fuck people like. I guess the dialogue? I guess? I just know that people reference it and they quote it all the time. Yeah. That's why I think that people like the dialogue, is because they quote it all the time. So it was, like, really hard for me to, like, I don't know. I didn't quite, I sort of see it. Again, I can put it sort of into its You know what really surprised me? This movie came out after Mortal Kombat. I don't know why that's so curious to me. I was looking it up, it was 1994, and it was the 90s, but it was 94, and I was like, huh. This was, like, way after it was, like, 3 years after Mortal Kombat. Sorry, no, 2 years after Mortal Kombat. And for some reason that was really strange to me. Maybe it's because, like, I don't know. This was, like, Tarantino's second movie? Theatrically released, at least, after Reservoir Dogs. And, like, so I guess that it was sort of like a new kind of countercultural thing. I don't know. I feel like in a lot of other cases I'm able to kind of put something into its context and still be able to and enjoy it in that way. But for some reason, I don't know, it didn't really hit for me. And I don't know if there's that much else. A lot of this movie is dialogue, and I found it somewhat entertaining, somewhat engaging. Like what? Let's see. Samuel L. Jackson's character is pretty funny, but that's like cheating, right? Some of the conversations are kind of interesting, I guess. I didn't care that much for Uma Thurman's character. I don't know. It just maybe wasn't something that's particularly appealed to me. So my fascination with my own opinion on this movie comes a lot from the fact that, like, if it was anything else, I probably would just leave it at, I didn't really get that much out of it. But I think because it's such a unique experience where I'm like, man, I feel like I know half of this movie before seeing it. It's, I keep trying to figure out, like, is there something that I haven't figured out how to put into words? Here's another thing. Because I was sort of trying to find, like, read other opinions on it, just to, like, get a little bit of a basis, just try and understand what other people think of it. And so a lot of things that I sort of found was people really like the dialogue, and it was very novel. It did a lot of things people weren't expecting the first time they saw it. I didn't find it particularly novel myself. I also think, I don't know how much this movie gains from being viewed as a whole. I think that the way that it's constructed with the nonlinearity means that it's kind of funny, because I feel like it's mostly most of the enjoyment of this film is found in the individual parts, the individual scenes and segments. And I already know all that shit. So viewing it as a whole didn't really give me that much. I don't think viewing it as a whole movie adds that much to the experience. The exception being that whole shit with Bruce Willis in the apartment, because it feels like things actually move from A to B to C in a way that's pretty engaging. I think that's why. Like, I know that there's, like, a Gex dungeon at some point in this movie, right? I just don't know when it's going to happen. And watching the chain of events actually unfold is like that part. That part hit well with me. I kind of wish the whole movie was like that, but as it is, a lot of it just sort of feels like a lot of start stops, and I don't know, asking me to be invested in scenes that I've already watched. Yeah, I don't know. Pulp Fiction, I guess, just not really a movie for me. Add this to the mountain of fucked up film takes I've had on this podcast, along with wishing that there were more human scenes in Sonic 2. Yeah, I just don't know if I think that's pretty much. I don't know if I have that much more to say. I don't know if I have that much to say about it besides trying to understand why I didn't enjoy it that much. Anything else funny? Maybe there's like some funny stuff. Like I laughed at a couple points. I think, I don't know, some of the stuff just feels very shocking. It feels like there's a lot of shock value stuff in the movie. I think the gore is part of that. I think the amount of like slurs in it. I think the only time I really felt, I don't know, it felt excessive to me. It's like, it felt a little forced, like the amount of like fucking hard R's in the film. The only time where it made sense to me was when Tarantino was saying it, funny enough, because the line about the dead storage is so, and the fact that he says it like 3 or 4 times in a row, it's such an absurd line that it became funny to me. Like it's so over the top. It doesn't even feel like racial at that point. It just feels bizarre. Like you have no idea how you're supposed to feel.